Welcome to Dark Ascent. I'm Matthew, and today I'll go over an Everest expedition where a content creator trusted a digital system to help guide decisions deep into the death zone. At altitude, she increasingly relied on phone notes to guide her pace and oxygen use, not realizing how quickly control can slip when the mountain changes. Looking back at how it unfolded, those choices take on a more unsettling weight. It was May 18th, 2023 on Mount Everest during a narrow summit window within the climbing season, with clear pre-dawn conditions at the South Col and a forecasted weather system expected to move in within the following days. Graylyn Baldwin was a 29-year-old outdoor content creator from Boulder, Colorado, who spent the past 5 years building a life around high-altitude trekking, cold weather expeditions, and solo travel documented for an online audience. She also worked remotely as a fitness coach, combining income streams to fund increasingly demanding expeditions without relying entirely on sponsorship support. Her most ambitious project, publicly announced in February 2023, was an attempt on Mount Everest. The announcement drew significant attention and immediate feedback from viewers, including detailed concerns from people familiar with high-altitude climbing. She responded by stating she had conducted extensive research and was working with experienced, vetted guides. "I don't think doing research is the problem. Nobody climbs Everest without preparing. The question is whether you're learning from people who've actually been up there or just collecting information that sounds convincing." The expedition budget was approximately $65,000, covering permits, logistics, oxygen systems, technical gear, and support personnel. A large portion was funded through brand partnerships tied to expedition content, including deliverables requiring summit footage and post-climb documentation. This introduced structural pressure into the expedition timeline, where delays or failure to summit would carry financial and contractual consequences beyond the climb itself. Like many climbers preparing for high-altitude expeditions, Graylyn organized extensive reference material during her training phase, including expedition reports, medical resources, and climbing guides. She also used AI-assisted tools to help structure and summarize this information into a more accessible format. Eventually, she compiled a detailed offline document stored on her phone containing notes, checklists, and decision guides covering acclimatization, oxygen management, altitude illness, and summit planning for use as a field reference during the expedition. I've gone through a lot of expedition planning setups, but this is one of the few times I've seen a phone document start carrying more weight than the guide beside her. In practice, this system functioned as an organizational tool for expedition planning rather than a real-time decision authority. It translated complex and variable environmental and physiological factors into simplified procedural rules intended for field reference. While the underlying information aligned with established mountaineering guidance, the output format emphasized consistency and optimization over situational discretion. Operational decision-making in high-altitude environments is typically adjusted dynamically by experienced guides based on real-time physiological observation, pacing tolerance, and environmental change. This adaptive layer cannot be fully represented in static planning frameworks. The document also covered summit timing. One of the ideas she pulled from it was that an earlier weather window could mean fewer people on the route, less waiting around at bottlenecks, and ultimately less time spent in the death zone. Later on, that became part of her reasoning for choosing May 9 instead of waiting until May 10, like her guide recommended. By this point, the document had become something she relied on pretty heavily. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was something she kept going back to when decisions needed to be made. The information itself wasn't necessarily bad. A lot of it came from legitimate climbing resources. But Everest isn't the kind of place where you can always pull out a set of guidelines and expect them to fit what's happening right in front of you. Sometimes the person who's standing beside you, looking at you, watching how you're moving and breathing, knows something a document never could. Supplemental oxygen slows this decline, but does not prevent it. Standard climbing flow rates in the death zone are around 3 liters per minute. Below 2 liters, the protective effect drops significantly, and at 1.5 liters, the physiological impact begins to approximate climbing without oxygen, only delayed in progression rather than prevented. On Everest, that's one of those details I've seen guides verify almost automatically because they've been in situations where getting it wrong escalated things fast. The 2023 season featured a narrow mid to late May summit window, with conditions on May 18th identified as viable before a forecasted weather system expected around May 20 to May 21. Expected winds ranged from 15 to 20 miles per hour, with summit temperatures near negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit and wind chill below negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Forecast notes also flagged uncertainty in timing, including the possibility of earlier system arrival. Above Camp 4, the route follows fixed ropes through steep, exposed terrain shared by multiple teams, creating bottlenecks during summit windows. The most significant congestion point is near the former Hillary Step area on the upper summit ridge at approximately 28,839 feet, where traffic often compresses into a single fixed-line bottleneck. Even in modern conditions, delays can vary significantly depending on congestion, weather, and rope management efficiency, with climbers frequently experiencing extended pauses in high-traffic summit windows. Graylin arrived at base camp on April 14th, 9 days before her first scheduled acclimatization rotation. She used the downtime for filming and expedition logistics before beginning her acclimatization schedule. She used ChatGPT to generate and organize guidance covering acclimatization planning, oxygen usage strategies, symptom recognition, weather window interpretation, and simplified forecasting checklists. These materials were incorporated into her broader planning document for field reference. While they were at base camp, her Sherpa guide recommended taking one more rest day before the next rotation. He wasn't completely comfortable with some of the readings he was seeing and thought a little more recovery time would be a good idea. Graylin chose not to make the change. She already had a timeline in mind for the expedition and wanted to stay on schedule. The discussion was later noted in the expedition log. If it were me, I'd have a hard time brushing off a guide asking for an extra rest day. They spend enough time watching climbers that those recommendations usually come from somewhere. The first rotation carried her from base camp through the Kumbo Icefall into the western Siduloam, where she reached Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet after staged progress over multiple days. The Icefall section, one of the most technically dangerous parts of the standard South Col route, was completed without incident. After a short rest period back at base camp, she began a second rotation that carried her from base camp up toward Camp 3, where sleep quality and appetite began to noticeably decline under sustained altitude exposure. During a later rotation between Camp 2 and Camp 3, she developed a mild headache and reduced appetite at Camp 2. These symptoms were consistent with expected altitude effects, though her guide recommended a more conservative response, including additional rest and potential descent for reassessment. She referenced her prepared field notes and chose to remain at altitude under a hydration and recovery protocol outlined in her planning material. She filmed briefly at camp and went to sleep. She returned to base camp the following day. Her guide recommended 2 full rest days before the next rotation. She took one. The second rotation began in early May. She ascended from base camp through Camp 1 and reached Camp 3 the next day, her highest elevation to that point. That night at Camp 3, she experienced markedly reduced sleep and significantly decreased food intake, both recognized indicators of incomplete acclimatization. While not diagnostic on their own, experienced guides use these combined patterns to assess physiological strain. Altitude. She did not explicitly report the severity of either to her guide the following morning. That night, she once again referred to her pre-compiled planning document, built from expedition reports, climbing resources, and AI-assisted summaries. The material suggested a conservative, overnight oxygen range of around 0.5 to 1 liter per minute as a theoretical efficiency guideline under rest conditions. She set her regulator to 1 liter per minute for sleep, while her guide used a higher flow rate of approximately 2 liters per minute in the adjacent tent under standard expedition protocols. She descended to base camp after the rotation and remained there for several days of rest before the next ascent phase. On the day of the summit decision, Graylin reviewed the long-range forecast, both with her guide and independently through her planning document. The document summarized common indicators of a viable summit window, including stable or rising barometric pressure, wind speeds below approximately 20 miles per hour, clear conditions, and a weakening or shifting jet stream. She applied these parameters to the available forecast data and assessed the approaching window as viable. The expedition company's commercial forecasting service provided the same underlying meteorological data with additional interpretation, describing the window as workable but narrow. It also noted uncertainty in the timing of an incoming system, with potential arrival ranging from the following day to 2 days later, depending on model variation. Her guide, interpreting both the forecast and on-mountain conditions, expressed a preference for delaying the summit push by approximately 24 hours. I always find weather discussions interesting because the forecast and the mountain aren't necessarily having the same conversation. If I'm climbing with an experienced guide, I'd want to know why they're seeing something different. However, Graylin ultimately chose to proceed earlier, citing reduced traffic on fixed lines compared to the expected congestion in the later window. On the following day, the team, Graylin, her guide, and 2 Sherpa support crew moved from base camp to Camp 4 at the South Col. Her pace was slower than in previous rotations, with more frequent rest stops on fixed-line sections where other teams maintained continuous movement. At Camp 4, she ate a partial meal and entered her sleeping bag in the early evening hours. Before sleeping, she reviewed her reference document and finalized her oxygen plan based on a multi-bottle expedition setup, typically consisting of 3 to 4 oxygen cylinders for the full summit rotation. Her strategy used lower flow rates during the lower ascent phases and increased delivery near the summit and descent, intended to stretch supply across a longer than expected summit window. Her guide maintained a steady and continuous flow strategy at approximately 3 liters per minute throughout the upper mountain, consistent with standard expedition practice. Her pulse oximeter reading at Camp 4 registered 68%, a low value at that altitude that concerned her guide when combined with reduced sleep, appetite, and a slower movement profile. While oxygen saturation readings at extreme altitude can vary widely between individuals, the broader trend was consistent with increasing physiological strain. She recorded the value, but did not relay it to her guide. I wouldn't treat a number like that in isolation, but I also wouldn't ignore it in context with everything else happening physically. She woke shortly after midnight, having slept for fewer than 3 hours. The team left Camp 4 in the pre-dawn hours under clear skies and stable wind conditions. Temperatures were well below freezing, and headlamp beams from multiple teams ahead traced a continuous line up the southeast ridge. The forecasted summit window still appeared to be holding, and conditions at departure were assessed as favorable at a glance. Graylin recorded a brief departure clip before moving on to the upper route. The initial section above Camp 4 traverses open snowfield before steepening toward the triangular face and the balcony at roughly 27,600 feet. The balcony functions as the first major checkpoint on the upper ridge, where guides typically reassess climber condition before committing to the final ascent. Under normal conditions, this section takes 2 to 3 hours of steady progress. As the climb continued, the team's pace slowed, with Graylin moving noticeably more slowly than on previous rotations, as her guide stayed closer to keep the group together on the fixed lines. At the balcony, they discovered her oxygen system had been running at around 1.5 liters per minute since leaving Camp 4 instead of the planned 2 liters per minute, and it was immediately increased to 3 liters per minute. By then, she had already spent about 90 minutes in the death zone, receiving less oxygen than intended. From the balcony, the team continued toward the south summit as dawn remained several hours away, and the margin for error narrowed. The south summit, the last practical decision point before the final ridge, came after several more hours of slow progress along the fixed lines, with her movement becoming increasingly labored and frequent short pauses required after minimal forward gain. At that elevation, her guide noted a clear decline in pace and efficiency in rope handling. Based on her condition, the time already spent in the upper death zone, and the remaining distance to the summit, he recommended turning back. One thing I always watch for in accounts like this is when basic tasks start taking noticeably more effort. To me, that's often more concerning than any single number on a device. She acknowledged the recommendation, but chose to continue upward. Conditions remained within the forecasted summit window as dawn began to break and winds stayed within expected ranges, though the incoming weather system was now advancing faster than later model projections, narrowing the margin for a safe stay or delayed descent. The final section from the south summit to the true summit follows a narrow, corniced ridge before reaching the former Hillary Step area, now a major bottleneck on the southeast ridge route where multiple teams converge, and the movement on fixed lines requires careful use of Jumar ascenders. Small errors at this stage carry immediate consequences due to exposure, fatigue, and extreme altitude, and the same terrain becomes equally demanding on descent under reduced cognitive and physical capacity. Graylin cleared this section and reached the summit in the early morning hours, among the later arrivals from the south side teams during that window, with conditions cold, windy, and clear under full daylight exposure. She remained on the summit for an extended stop, recording multiple angles of footage, including sponsor acknowledgements and direct-to-camera segments. I get why she wanted to stay. If I'd spent years working towards standing on top of Everest, I would also want to soak in every second too. Most other climbers limited their summit time to brief stops before descending, consistent with standard practice at that altitude. Within a short period, Graylin's coordination on the fixed line deteriorated beyond the level of fatigue typically expected during descent. She showed increasing difficulty with sequential rope management, including controlled transitions between anchors and maintaining balance on steep, exposed terrain where minor errors carry immediate consequence. At the Hillary step on descent, she was no longer able to independently manage her Jumar and fixed line transitions. Her guide intervened directly, assisting with clipping and unclipping while positioning himself above her to maintain control of her attachment system. Other climbers were delayed behind the team during this section, as the passage through the bottleneck slowed significantly at high altitude. The descent was getting slower and slower. Between the Hillary step and the south summit, Graylin made 2 unplanned stops on the fixed line. During those pauses, she didn't consistently respond when people spoke to her and often remained motionless until someone prompted her to move. By this point, it was becoming clear that this was more than exhaustion. She wasn't just slowing down physically, she was also having trouble responding and making decisions on her own. By mid-morning, the team had passed the south summit on descent and was moving through the ridge toward the balcony. Wind conditions had strengthened, with increasing cloud cover advancing from the southwest and reducing overall visibility across lower elevations. Temperatures had dropped significantly, and wind chill conditions were becoming more severe. The incoming weather system was now arriving earlier than the more optimistic forecast projections had indicated. I think the 2 unplanned stops are easy to overlook when you're reading a long expedition report. But when someone just stops moving on a fixed line at nearly 29,000 feet and doesn't respond normally, that's not something I'd be comfortable ignoring. At a point during this descent, Graylin's supplemental oxygen supply was fully depleted. The exhaustion of supply resulted from cumulative consumption across the ascent, summit stay, and early descent phases, combined with earlier inefficiencies in regulator settings that led to uneven delivery rates. Although adjustments had been made at higher altitude, the remaining reserve had already been reduced under suboptimal usage conditions, leaving a limited buffer for the return. Her guide immediately transferred her onto a personal reserve bottle, restoring supplemental oxygen at a standard flow rate. Despite this intervention, her physical control continued to decline. She required continuous assistance to remain upright on the fixed line, with team members stabilizing her movement as her ability to bear weight became increasingly inconsistent. Her responsiveness diminished, and she ceased initiating movement without direct prompting. The descent rate slowed significantly as the team adapted to assisted movement conditions in exposed terrain. At this stage, the clinical trajectory was consistent with severe altitude-related cerebral impairment. High-altitude cerebral edema typically progresses from cognitive slowing to loss of coordination, followed by a collapse of autonomous motor function and eventual unresponsiveness if descent is not achieved. At extreme altitude, this progression is accelerated by continued hypoxia and physical exertion and cannot be reversed without sustained descent to lower elevations where oxygen availability improves. Although supplemental oxygen was briefly restored through the guide's reserve supply, the terrain, congestion, and environmental conditions limited the rate of descent below what would be required to meaningfully interrupt the physiological decline already underway. The section between the south summit and the balcony, roughly 1,100 vertical feet, is exposed, steep in sections, and requires deliberate individual movement on fixed lines that cannot be bypassed. A climber unable to bear their own weight must be physically assisted, and at nearly 28,000 feet in deteriorating conditions, that assistance becomes slow slow, inefficient, and increasingly costly for everyone involved. Over the course of the descent, the team covered only about 600 vertical feet in roughly 90 minutes, a pace reflecting near total loss of independent mobility from the primary climber. 4 descending climbers from other teams intermittently assisted, stabilizing her movement while also managing their own rapidly diminishing oxygen reserves. I always have a lot of respect for climbers who stop to help in situations like this. They're exhausted, they're burning through their own oxygen, and they still choose to get involved. Helicopter evacuations aren't possible at that altitude on Everest. The air is simply too thin, which meant there was no way for outside help to reach them. No rescue team could be flown in, and there wasn't another route down. The only way off the mountain was the same fixed line they were already on. By mid-morning, the guide's spare oxygen was gone. That meant the guide and both Sherpa team members were now above 27,000 feet without supplemental oxygen themselves. At the same time, the weather was getting worse. Winds were picking up, temperatures were dropping, and the clouds were starting to close in around the ridge. Running out of backup oxygen up there is something I can't even imagine dealing with. Every option suddenly becomes worse at the exact moment you need options most. By late morning on the southeast ridge, at roughly 27,200 feet, about 900 vertical feet above Camp 4, Gray Lynn was no longer responsive. She had become fully non-ambulatory on the fixed line, unable to bear weight or follow verbal directions. At that point, forward movement was no longer possible. She was secured in place on the rope while the team initiated emergency radio contact with base camp. With their own supplemental, oxygen exhausted and exposure time continuing to accumulate, the 2 Sherpa support crew were advised to begin immediate descent to reduce further risk. The guide remained with her as conditions worsened. Through the early afternoon, the weather degraded rapidly. Winds strengthened into sustained gale force conditions, and wind chill dropped well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility collapsed as cloud cover and blowing snow overtook the ridge. By late afternoon, Gray Lynn showed no response to repeated checks and no detectable pulse. She was pronounced deceased at location via base camp medical radio protocol at approximately 27,200 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The guide later descended with assistance from a Sherpa recovery team dispatched once communication confirmed the situation. The body remained secured on the fixed line due to conditions and altitude constraints. Gray Lynn's body was recovered several days later after the weather system had cleared. A 5-person recovery team coordinated through the expedition. Logistics provider and operating under authorization from Nepal's tourism authorities completed the operation in roughly 13 hours round trip from base camp. Her camera, phone, and personal equipment were recovered and returned to her family. The phone contained footage through the summit and approximately 9 minutes into the descent before recording stopped. I can't help but think about those final recordings. At the time, they were probably meant to document an achievement, and now they're part of the last record of what happened on the mountain. A formal post-expedition review was later conducted by the logistics provider and an independent high-altitude medicine consultant retained by her family. The review identified the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema with secondary hypoxic cardiac arrest. Contributing factors included reduced oxygen flow rates during the ascent, limited acclimatization and recovery time, extended time spent at the summit, and a delayed descent after the onset of significant cognitive impairment. The review found no direct negligence on the part of expedition staff. It also noted that the reference material recovered from her phone contained generally accurate mountaineering information, but that it could not substitute for real-time physiological assessment and field judgment under extreme altitude conditions.